Welcome to the Peter King Podcast, a post-draft, late night Peter King podcast, recording this late on Sunday night, April 30. And it's amazing. I don't know how this happened, but Myles Simmons, we are already into May. And when people listen to this, it'll be May. And I wonder when we're actually going to get some spring weather. I have no idea, but it isn't really happening. I think people are building arcs right now in New York. I was just out walking the dog quickly tonight, and I came back in even after having a raincoat on. I had to change all my clothes. It's insane out there right now. But how you doing, Myles?
I'm a little discombobulated that we are doing this on a Sunday night. It is very different, but that is good because we do need to recap this draft. And I, like you, am very much ready for spring weather, although it is different, in Los Angeles because spring weather just means I want it to be sunny and 70 degrees. And it really hasn't been that for a long time. So yes, I know everybody has a lot of sympathy for me for somebody who lives in sunshine and 70 degrees every day, but it's just been very gray, We got the May gray a little bit early. So I'm looking forward to the sun coming back.
Wild, wacky stuff. Somebody once said that. Okay. So I'm going to run down exactly what we're going to do in this podcast. No matter who you're a fan of, I think we're going to touch your team in the next hour. But I'm going to start the podcast by basically explaining to you what my weekend was. It was really a zany weekend, but it was a lot of fun, and I was able to accomplish a lot in a 3-day period. So I'm going to explain my weekend, and then I'm going to talk to you about where I was. I was in the Raiders draft room for round one. I thought it was 9, but I think it's the 8th time in my career that I've been in a team's draft room on draft weekend. And this wasn't particularly eventful, but I think it was interesting. And I'll tell you why, because I think it explains a lot about where the Raiders are right now and what Mark Davis's expectations are for this Raider team. So I'm going to get into that, and then we're going to talk about the Raiders. And then we're going to go into, in no particular order, okay? We're going to get into the crazy, crazy trade. I thought it was crazy anyway, that Houston's Nick Caserio made in moving up from 12 to 3 with Arizona. And look, as I wrote in my column, an inauspicious debut for Monty Ossenfort on his first draft weekend with the Cardinals. He gets dinged by the league for improper contact and tampering with Jonathan Gannon at an improper time during the Eagles' postseason run. We'll get into all that, but then talk about a rebound. And look, the Arizona Cardinals right now own the 2024 draft. It is rather amazing. We're going to get into my visit with CJ Stroud in Houston. Had a really interesting conversation with him in Houston. I think he has handled this S2 stuff fantastic. He's not shooting the messenger. He's basically just saying, okay, look, I hear everybody. I hear everything. I see everything. And we'll just see how it goes. And you can just tell that he is in the proverbial keeping receipts mode right now. But he and Will Anderson, I watched their press conference in Houston on Friday. They were fabulous, just fabulous. And I can imagine Houston Texans fans haven't had a lot to cheer about, but I think these two guys are going to be really good for that franchise. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about those two teams, Houston and Arizona. We're going to get into Indianapolis and why they picked Anthony Richardson. We are then going to get into Lamar Jackson and the Ravens and the re-signing and what exactly it all means. We're going to get into Aaron Rodgers and going to New York. And on Saturday night, being in a prime seat for the Rangers over the Devils at Madison Square Garden. And then on Sunday afternoon, 19 hours later, He's in Madison Square Garden again to see the opener of Heat Knicks. So, I mean, Aaron Rodgers is already investing more time in the New York offseason than he did in a Green Bay offseason, at least in recent years.
Yeah.
So we'll get into that a little bit. And then, look, in my column, and hopefully you will read my column at NBCsports.com or profootballtalk.com. But I do a little section in this column, my nuggets of the week, 10 nuggets. Okay. Have you ever heard of Lucas Van Ness? Well, you will after you read this column. Lucas Van Ness, first round pick of the Green Bay Packers, and believed to be the first player in NFL history to ever be a first round pick after never starting a game in college football. So we're going to get into Lucas Van Ness. We're going to get into my feeling about, I don't think Will Levis was jobbed or kind of screwed by the process. It's a simple issue of supply and demand. There were 3 teams that really wanted a quarterback very high in this draft. And so they picked one. And, you know, there's no shame in being the 4th quarterback picked in a draft. And we'll get into that a little bit. We'll get into why the Seattle Seahawks, I mean, I think John Schneider did a fantastic job because, look, corner and wide receiver in modern football are 2 of the 5 most important position groups. I think it's quarterback, tackle, edge rusher, corner, wide receiver. You put them in whatever order you want. But John Schneider, on most boards right now, got the best corner and the best receiver in this draft. Kudos to John Schneider. He never gets to pick this high, but he did this year. And I think he came away very, very happy. Going to give some kudos to Trent Baalke, the Jacksonville general manager, for 2 really smart trades. We're going to talk a little bit about Chris Vaughn, the Dallas Cowboys scout, who had his son taken in the 6th round, and the tears were flowing. Even old Mr. Cratchit, Jerry Jones, he's, you know, he talks to Chris Vaughn's son, the 6th round pick. It just was a great thing. I'm sure you've seen this video. It's just unbelievable. I'm going to attempt to bring a little bit of sobriety into the Jalen Carter story. And look, I think Howie Roseman did a good job in picking him up and all that. Don't get me wrong, but let's not call this a brilliant pick yet. Let's let this guy stay on the field. He's a great football player, but let's let this guy stay on the field for a while. And let's see if he fits in and if he plays harder and practices harder than he did at Georgia. And then I've got a few things to say about the S2 test, which I think has been ridiculously over important in this draft process. And then I'm just going to tell you one story about why, in my opinion, okay, we have just got to cool our jets about making draft weekend the savior for 32 franchises. It is just, and look, I realize on television, people get excited and people are into what every team is doing and all that stuff. But look, I've got a long section of my column this week, Miles, in which I look back at the 2020 draft. Okay, so these guys have had 3 years now. And I think I can say pretty confidently that of the 32 picks in the 2020 draft, after 3 football seasons, there are 7 legitimate stars out of 32. That's it. So what I'm saying to you is, if you got a 22% success rate in the first round of making superstars, let's not treat everybody drafted in the first round like he's a superstar. Anyway, Miles, I have taken the floor for far too much time. I want to ask you, as somebody who analyzed everything over the weekend, what stood out to you and what is your big takeaway from draft weekend?
Oh, first of all, Peter, people come here to listen to you. This is the Peter King podcast, so you talk as much as you want, man. I liked a lot of things that the Texans did, and I think making that bold move was something that Nick Caserio probably felt like he had to do. And I also understand, man, looking at that and you say, wow, that is a lot to give up for a defensive end. But at the end of the day, if you have the 2 and 3 picks and you have to pay however much you have to pay for a trade in it, right, in draft compensation, then you get a franchise quarterback and let's call it a franchise edge rusher. You get those 2 cornerstones for your franchise.
Right.
Then you have set yourself up in theory for the next 5 to 7 years, if not longer than that. Right. So I loved that Nick Caserio did that. And I was very glad that he did not actually end up picking a defensive end with his first pick and then just kind of like languishing there and letting it go until number 12 until they may or may not have gotten the quarterback they wanted. They were aggressive. They got the 2 guys that they wanted. And now they have, at least in theory, set themselves up very well to be successful.
I agree with you, Miles, if Will Anderson is a franchise edge rusher defensive. Yeah. And
yes.
The jury's out on that. We just simply don't know if it is yet. And again, look, here's the thing that I would just say in general. We can all have our opinions. Okay. And I just finished reading Mel Kiper breaking down every team. The lowest grade he gave any of the 32 teams is a B-, which to some degree, it gives you the idiocy of draft grades, first of all, right, the day after the draft ends. But I would just say in general, one thing that in some ways I appreciate about that. It's because we can't know right now.
Right.
And like, I've seen a lot of criticism out there about Aiden O'Connell, who was the Raiders' 4th round draft pick. And they're saying, oh my God, this is a 7th round guy or whatever. Look, the Raiders want a young backup. They don't know if Brian Hoyer is going to make their team as the backup to Jimmy Garoppolo. They just don't know.
Yeah.
And they want to start training a young backup and start to do something like Josh McDaniels did in New England with Jarrett Stidham. And that's the purpose of this guy. And so if you take him at whatever it was, 135 instead of 212, who cares? I mean, right, if he serves the purpose you draft him for, taking him at the end of the 4th round is not a bad trade. But anyway.
Well, one thing on that, Peter, and I'll just add to it. The thing that always kind of like makes my mind boggle is when people say, especially right after the draft, like, oh, wow, why did X team pick that player when they could have had that player in a round or 2 or whatever it happens to be? And the reality is we really don't know whether or not that's true, right? We have no idea what these teams' draft boards actually look like. I mean, we understand what people who spend a lot of time, and I don't mean to denigrate what people, who work out pre-draft grades or whatever you want to call it, pre-draft scouting reports, and they go through mock drafts. People spend a lot of time on that and they work very hard on that. But at the same time, they don't have access to 32 teams' draft boards. So when we sit here and we say, oh man, I can't believe they picked that guy in the 4th round. Why would you do that? You could have had him in the 7th round. We really don't know that. And frankly, if a team is drafting for itself, then that team should know exactly what they want out of that particular player so that they can come in and then be successful. And they can coach them up and they can be successful. Look at Kansas City's draft last year, right? And all of those rookies who contributed something. Isaiah Pacheco's the 7th round pick. And if you redraft right now, he might be a 1st round pick from that 2022 draft class. All these teams have scouting reports and they do things so that they understand what it is, at least they try to understand as best they can, what it is that they are drafting, who it is that they are drafting. So I don't know. It takes a lot for me as just somebody who, covers the NFL every day to be like, oh man, I don't like that pick. I don't know if I like it or not. I'll know in a couple of years,
Yeah,
But
exactly.
it's just, you hope that all these guys work out knowing that for
Yeah,
their sake, knowing that they won't. And we go from there.
yeah. Um, Myles, before we take our first break, let me get into a little bit of what my weekend was, and let's talk a little bit about why the Raiders did what they did. Okay, so this year I looked for a team to try to get in their draft room. It's always a fun thing. It's insightful. By the time you get to Monday, I think the last thing you want to read is another sports writer reviewing who had good drafts and blah blah blah. So I try to get in draft rooms. Sometimes it works. I got turned down by 3 teams this year, and then luckily, thanks to the Raiders, to Josh McDaniels and Dave Ziegler and Mark Davis, even though I don't know if Davis was involved in this at all. Thank them for letting me in their room to basically get a peek behind the curtain. And I'll explain to you a little bit about why I thought the Raiders were interesting. This is year 2 of Ziegler McDaniels. Had a bad year last year. They lost their quarterback. Things did not go well. And so now this is a big, big draft. When they drafted Tyree Wilson, that is an important pick for them. And I'll get back to the Raiders in a second, but I'll tell you, I had intended, after doing the Raiders on that first night, to go to Detroit to see the Lions after round 3 on Friday. This is a team that was scheduled to have 5 picks in the first 3 rounds, including 6 and 18. And I thought, this is going to be a really, really interesting team. And don't get me wrong, the Lions are very interesting, and I think they're a really interesting Super Bowl dark horse pick. But after CJ Stroud happened, I talked to our friend and boss, Matt Casey at NBC about, what about the Texans? And he was very bullish on me switching my plans and getting up and going to Houston instead of Detroit. So that's what I did. I went to Houston, spent a couple hours at their facility, spent time with Nick Caserio, with CJ Stroud, and basically just tried to get a feel of what happened with them. We'll talk about that a bit. And then I decided, since, of course, the Houston Astros were in town to play the Phillies, I decided I'm going to go watch 3 or 4 innings. So I watched the first 4 innings of the Houston-Philadelphia game, then went back to my hotel room and watched pretty much all of round 3, got on the phone a little bit, and then got up pretty early on Saturday morning and flew home. And I've been here at my home in Brooklyn since about mid-afternoon Saturday. We record this late Sunday night. I am, 500 words away from being finished with the column, which I'll do as soon as we get off here. And the reason we wanted to do this and wanted to do the podcast right now is that, first of all, by the time, if we did this at a normal time, like midday Tuesday, or put it out midday Tuesday, the draft is already, the first round is 5 days old. We thought, let's just hit everything and do it and put the link in Football Morning in America. So people, if they want to, when they wake up Monday morning on their way into work, they can listen to this. They can certainly read the column if they choose. So that is what I did this weekend. And I just simply wanted to explain what went into my thought process about doing the Raiders and then doing the Texans. So, Myles, a couple of things about the Raiders. People are going to say, well, geez, what exactly happened with the Raiders and why did they pick Tyree Wilson? So I'm walking through the facility midday Thursday, and I'm going to Dave Ziegler's office, the GM. And Josh McDaniels and Dave Ziegler sit down in his office, and this is like their last pre-draft meeting, and McDaniels, they had just finished 3 months of work. They finished stacking their board all the way down through 7 rounds late on or midday Wednesday. So they were done. They were all that hay was in the barn, so to speak, and they were ready to go. And McDaniels is sitting on a couch in the office of Dave Ziegler. Ziegler, 47 years old, McDaniels, 45. They, even though Mark Davis said to me at one point, I didn't bring these guys in to be basically Patriots West. I brought them in because I thought they were really smart football people. Anyway, Josh McDaniels says to, just out of the clear blue sky, he says to Dave Ziegler, you know what we need? We need 3 quarterbacks to be picked in the top 6. So they go back and forth. And so we leave there and I say to McDaniels, what are you talking about? Why do you need 3 quarterbacks to go? And he said, we've basically got 4 players, non-quarterbacks, who are very, very close with their grades. It's almost a pick 'em, basically, with their grades between the offensive tackle at Ohio State, Paris Johnson, between the cornerback from Illinois, Devin Witherspoon, and between the 2 edge players, 2 defensive ends. Obviously, Tyree Wilson of Texas Tech and Willie Anderson of Alabama. So they had finished talking and now they were going to go their separate ways before the draft. But the one thing that hit me is I said, man, I think 3 quarterbacks are going to get picked in the top 6. And so they go into the draft that night, and fast forward a little bit. They go into the room and obviously Bryce Young goes first. CJ Stroud goes second. Then it's Willie Anderson third. And here come the Colts. And everybody thinks this is where Will Levis goes. But honestly, the Raiders did not care whether it was Will Levis or Anthony Richardson.
Right.
They didn't care at all. They just wanted it to be one of those 2 guys. And when Anthony Richardson was announced as the pick in the room, Josh McDaniels got a huge grin on his face, and he and Dave Ziegler come up next to each other, slap hands, and are both thrilled, because this means that no matter what happens at 5 and 6, it means that they will get one of their 4 players at number 7, one of their 4 desired players. So obviously Witherspoon goes 5, and Paris Johnson, who I believe would have been the pick. The Raiders wouldn't tell me. I believe he would have been the pick at 7. But anyway, so Paris Johnson goes 6. And then obviously Tyree Wilson becomes the pick of the Las Vegas Raiders. But 2 interesting points about this. So right before this happened, right before, when they are still unsure of how exactly this is going to go, you've got Dave Ziegler on the phone with Monty Ossenfort, the general manager of the Arizona Cardinals. Now, remember, the Cardinals had gone down to number 12. And now the Cardinals were talking to teams above them, trying to figure out, we want to trade back up. So Ossenfort is on the phone with Dave Ziegler. But understand one thing, Miles. Dave Ziegler is, Monty Ossenfort knows that Ziegler might be picking Paris Johnson. That's the player they want. So in other words, although Monty Ossenfort is setting some groundwork, if Paris Johnson, if Detroit doesn't trade and Paris Johnson is still on the board at number 7, if they're setting groundwork for that, there was this feeling in the room that even though in the Raiders room, that even though they were talking to Monty Ossenfort, that if Monty Ossenfort wants Paris Johnson, he's probably not going to get him if he has to trade with the Raiders, because the Raiders, I think, wanted him too. So that was a little bit of a cat and mouse game that was really kind of fun. But anyway, so that's sort of what I thought about that place. It was funny. At the end of the evening, the Raiders were trying, not feverishly by any stretch, but they made a couple of phone calls. At the end of the first round, or high in the second, they wanted to get Michael Mayer, the tight end from Notre Dame. So they talked to a couple of teams, and then they talked to Kansas City, and Kansas City gave them such a bad, lopsided offer in favor of Kansas City that, Ziegler just gets off the phone and he said, "We're not doing that." And there's a little part of their room, a big board that analyzes with point totals on it, because everybody now uses draft trade value charts. And
Yes.
it was very lopsided in Kansas City's favor. So they weren't going to do it. It ended up that they, with the fourth pick of the third round, or of the second round on Friday, they ended up trading up and getting Michael Mayer, who I think will just step into either the starting job or 30 snaps a game at least at tight end with the Raiders. But anyway, that's a little bit of what I saw with the Raiders on Thursday night.
What's interesting to me, Peter, is that it seems like the Raiders were very off of quarterback. And I don't know that everyone would have thought that heading into this draft, just based on the fact that they had Jimmy Garoppolo, sure. But, if one of those guys maybe would have fallen, it doesn't seem like that's something that was really a consideration. They had those 4 non-quarterbacks, and those were the guys that they were targeting, and those were the guys that they figured that they really wanted. And, when you see them that they then pick a developmental guy, more later in the on day 3, then I guess that all kind of comes together and it makes sense.
There was one other little fun note, sort of an inside football note that I haven't seen before, but, I'm sure in this modern era of football where everyone is concerned how they look publicly, about 45 minutes after picking Tyree Wilson, the Raiders, a few of their guys went out to either get a bite to eat or do a little research or to do whatever. But McDaniels went back to his office. He was going to have his first extended conversation now with Tyree Wilson. So his football ops guy, a guy named Tom Jones, gets Tyree Wilson on the phone, gives McDaniels the phone, and basically Josh McDaniels said, "Hey, so excited you're a Raider. You're going to help us win a lot of games," and all that. And he goes, "But I want to touch base on a few things." And I'll read you what I wrote in my column. He goes, "Just want to touch base on a few things. You're going to talk to me." This is Josh McDaniels talking to Tyree Wilson. "I just want to touch base on a few things. You're going to talk to media here in a bit, and I wanted to give you a few points to consider. Be humble, which you are. Stay away from predictions. That way you won't have to eat them later. Don't talk about timelines with your foot." Everybody knows probably that Tyree Wilson had foot surgery last November. He's doing fine and probably will be back ready to go at the start of training camp.
He didn't stay away from the timelines with his foot, though, because he told the media right after that he should be back by training camp.
Don't talk about timelines with your foot.
Whoops. And then he did it.
You don't want your draft story to be all about your foot. Now, you got a fan base that's second to none. They're going to love you. Just express how excited you are, which I know you are. And so that was something I hadn't seen before, sort of, the first extended conversation that McDaniels had with him. There was a big chunk of it about media training, and just, say the right things, which most players do in their opening press conference with a team. But anyway, so that's where I was. That's what I did. It was really interesting. It was enlightening. I always learn something. I learn a lot when I'm able to sit in a draft room and watch how teams operate sort of behind the curtain. Anyway, we're going to take a short break now, and we'll be right back to talk about everything else that happened in the draft. Myles, we have 25 minutes to talk about 259 picks or whatever there were. I don't know that we'll get to every one, but we might get to 4 or 5. So we'll be back right after this. So back on the podcast, we're going to wrap up the rest of the league in the second half of the podcast. And Myles, I want to start off in Houston with my trip to Houston and just say, look, in our business, we don't root for people. We don't root for teams. We basically root for our own stories. At least that's the way I am. It's going to be hard for me not to hope that CJ Stroud has some success. How much success, I don't know. But I've just gotten really sour on the whole S2 thing because this is a test that nobody heard of 2 months ago. Nobody, other than people in the league. It's 8 years old. It's this cognitive test that is supposed to measure how well you process, how quickly you process information. So for a quarterback, you come back from, you get the snap from center and you look in the secondary to try to make decisions. And this test really started to get some attention last year because the highest scoring quarterback on the test in 2022 coming into the draft was Brock Purdy. So Brock Purdy was the last player picked in the draft, and he comes in and he plays so well in the 8 games he plays for the 49ers that they said, hey, you're our starter. So I think that was really sort of an interesting introduction of the S2 test and blah, blah, blah. But I just think it's gotten out of control a bit. Like, you cannot succeed in the NFL unless you score well on this test. And I don't know about you. I don't watch a lot of college football, but anybody who watched the Georgia game in the college playoffs, anybody would say that if you say that this guy, CJ Stroud, can't process information or whatever, I'd call you crazy. He was phenomenal. 348 yards, 4 touchdowns, no interceptions, scored 41. Ohio State scored 41 points. And you don't do that. You don't do that against the best defense in college football if you're a schmo who's slow and can't process information. So I want to read you one line from CJ Stroud when I met him. And I thought it was really, really interesting. I'm just going to read this from you because I think you'll kind of appreciate it. He said, for me, I know my film speaks for itself. I think I've been one of the most consistent players in college football for the last 2 years. If you turn on the tape, you can answer the questions. But those who don't understand tape might want to go to other things and analyze other things. They're more than welcome to do such. But the people who are making the choices and the picks, they know what I can do. They understood the IQ that I do have. And he said, a lot of people haven't played the sport, and critics are going to critique. I think you could just tell. Look, he was very polite. And I believe that he feels right now, I'll show you. I don't know. We haven't had a lot of discussion about the S2 test or about Stroud. We talked a little bit about him last week, but I'm just curious, your thoughts about the test and about Stroud.
I don't know enough about the test to really have an opinion on the test. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's sort of nebulous, and we sort of understand, it tests processing power and it's this and it's that. And Brock Purdy did really well and all that. But what other quarterback has been in a situation that was with that Brock Purdy had, when he has to come in and, I guess he's got one of the best, if not the best left tackle in the league in Trent Williams. He gets to hand the ball off to Christian McCaffrey. He has Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel and George Kittle. And, he's also running Kyle Shanahan's offense, which is very, very famously quarterback friendly. So there was no better situation for Brock Purdy to be dropped into last year than that situation. And he still has to go out there and execute. And I don't want to take anything away from what Brock Purdy did, because it was extremely impressive. And he earned the right to be the incumbent starter. However, I don't think that just because Brock Purdy did well on whatever the S2 test is, means that because CJ Stroud did or did not do well on this S2 test, that means he's going to be a bust. I think what you said is very true. You look at the performance that he had against Georgia, the lights were brightest. And if the kicker makes the freaking field goal, then Ohio State's playing in the college football national championship game and not Georgia. So, there are other examples of this too, right? You look at the Rose Bowl that he had the season before, and he was tremendous in that game. So I also am not one who roots for players or whatnot. I root for stories, because I think interesting stories are interesting fodder for things like us to talk about, right? Guys like us to talk about. But it's hard for me when you see the sort of teardown job that went into CJ Stroud in this pre-draft process. It's hard for me to not be like, man, I hope he really does work out. And, also the fact that he and Bryce Young are friends. I don't know if you saw the clip that was kind of floating around on social media, Peter, of them, embracing after they had both been picked back in the green room. That to me was really, really cool. And, for those two guys to be pals and to get picked 1-2, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I thought so too. And I think, look, I witnessed the press conference between with the two players, and also with Nick Caserio and D'Amico Ryans. And look, it was just a lot of happy talk, but
certainly
I think that, first of all, I don't know, I'll follow Willie Anderson anywhere, man. That guy, he is one impressive young man. I'll tell you that much. He's really, really very good. But I thought that CJ Stroud did a great job in that too. But anyway, hey, look, Myles, we'll see what happens.
Right.
This is all in the hands of Willie Anderson. All I'm saying, it's like my daughter Laura King says. He always says, Dad, I'm just saying. And I'm just saying that if the Houston Texans, like I have a PFF analytics guy in my column today as we speak, I got him saying that the odds are right now that the two teams with the best chance to pick at the top of the draft this year are Arizona and Houston. And what that means is that, look, Arizona could have two very high picks in a draft. There's so many implications of this. And we don't want to go too far afield, but imagine if Kyler Murray really struggles this year, or he comes back from his ACL and he's just not that good, and this coaching staff is not crazy about him. His coaching and personnel staff didn't pick him. So imagine if all that happens and they're facing next year having the first pick, and Caleb Williams or Moy from North Carolina. Imagine that story and what's going to happen there next year. So I absolutely don't want to open the proverbial can of worms yet, but it's going to be an interesting year. And look, one of the other things is, how much pressure does this put on Willie Anderson? A lot. So anyway, we'll get into all that, I'm sure, as the year goes on. But let's talk about a couple of other things that I both wrote about and that I thought were really sort of big events that happened. First of all, the Indianapolis Colts picking a player who has started 13 college games, won 6 of them, and had some big struggles. last game of his college career against Florida State. He's 9 of 27. But I had a conversation with Chris Ballard on Saturday night, and he said that one of their scouts comes up to him during the year last year, during the football season, and said, I'm watching this kid in practice, meaning Anthony Richardson. I'm watching this kid in practice, and I'm drooling. I cannot believe how great he is. And so, look, we all know that there's no insurance for this stuff, no guarantee. But I think Chris Ballard's whole point is that, look, we want the guy who we believe with very good coaching. And they brought in a quarterback coach, in essence, Shane Steichen, with very good coaching. We believe that we're going to get the best out of him. And the only one bit of caution, and I was talking to Ballard about this Saturday night. I hear everybody saying, oh, he's got to play. He needs the experience. Anthony Richardson should be in the game. I mean, I guess I would just make 2 points. Patrick Mahomes sat for all but one game of his first year. He wasn't, in horrible shape because of that. The last 2 Green Bay quarterbacks, Brett Favre, Aaron Rodgers, they sat their first years. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that sitting instead of being rushed in before you're ready is the way to go. But we'll see what happens. And Ballard wouldn't commit to anything at all. He said, listen, we just have to get him in here and see where he is as a player. We'll analyze that. But, as Ballard said, it's impossible to make that call right now.
Yeah, and that makes plenty of sense. I mean, I think when you have somebody like a Shane Steichen who has worked with 2 of the best young quarterbacks in the entire National Football League in the last 3 years, in Justin Herbert and then with Jalen Hurts, there's reason to feel like, okay, this can work. You at least have put Anthony Richardson in a good situation. They also have Jim Bob Cooter on the staff. He's another guy who has worked with a bunch of different quarterbacks, worked with Trevor Lawrence last year and helped in that development in Jacksonville. So I like the move because it's bold, right? And it's something where you don't necessarily expect it, because Indianapolis is like a place of drop back quarterbacks. You would think Will Levis is probably going to be that guy, but it's not. And they are going in a different direction, and they believe in Anthony Richardson's ability. And, when I listen to Jim Irsay call him a superhero and say, if we had the number 1 overall pick, this is who we would have taken. That to me signals that they have a ton of belief in Anthony Richardson's ability and in his character to become the face of the franchise. So I'm really interested to see how this works out.
Yeah, I think it's really an interesting thing to follow, as are so many things in the draft. Let's, Myles, I'm going to change it up just a little bit, but
all right,
I do want to make sure that we get into Howie Roseman and the drafting of Jalen Carter. I'm not exactly sure why, but to me, I seem to have read 100 critiques of the Eagles draft, and everybody loves it. And what a brilliant pick by Howie Roseman to get Jalen Carter. My whole point is, it might be a brilliant pick. How anybody can just not consider all of the off the field negatives about Jalen Carter and just automatically say, because Howie Roseman, who right now is absolutely unequivocally state of the art. Yeah. And I think he's a terrific drafter, terrific general manager. Can't say enough good things about him. But this is a risky pick, period. Let's see how it turns out. That's one of the reasons why I think doing draft grades, the day after the draft is the height of absurdity. As we talked about at the beginning, I mean, just think, 7 of 32 picks from 3 years ago, 22%, 7 of 32 have been big hits. So let's just, I don't want to be cliche and say, let's pump the brakes on Jalen Carter, but Let's pump the brakes on
Well,
Jalen.
yeah, I mean, that's kind of exactly what it is that you were doing. You were pumping the brakes on Jalen Carter. I'll say this about the Eagles, though. Think about a locker room and an environment and a place that you would want somebody to be in. Or, I mean, if I'm a young defensive tackle, a place that I would want to go, it would be Philadelphia, right? You think about the way that they rotate guys in and out, and we can expect that they're going to still do that. Nick Sirianni's still the head coach, even though Jonathan Gannon is now with the Arizona Cardinals. You also have real strong veteran presence there, right? Between a Fletcher Cox and a Brandon Graham. Those guys understand what it is to be a pro. And I mean, if I'm Jalen Carter, I'm pulling right up next to Fletcher Cox and I'm saying, man, just teach me everything you know. And he's got guys in that locker room that he knows as well, who know him from the Georgia Bulldogs defense, because now, famously, as we all probably know, Howie Roseman has picked up 5 players from that 2021 Georgia National Championship team's defense, right? Plus also DeAndre Swift, who happens to be a former Georgia Bulldog as well as running back, and they got him from Detroit in a draft day trade. So I feel like there is enough veteran leadership in that locker room that Jalen Carter should be fine. But that also is up to Jalen Carter, right? Like I said, if it's me, I'm pulling up next to Fletcher Cox. We'll see if Jalen Carter does that.
I think that's a wise way to look at it right now. So one of the other points to make about this draft that I thought was really interesting, we mentioned a bit in the open, is what John Schneider did. And look, I think I wasn't alone. I think a lot of people had Jalen Carter mocked to the Seattle Seahawks at number 5. But what really interested me is that I didn't think they were going to take a corner at number 5. I didn't think that was their big position of need or anything like that. But what John Schneider did in basically playing it right down the middle and taking the best corner and the best receiver in the draft is he said, look, we may never be in this position again. Never.
Yeah. And
I am going to take 2 cornerstone players for our team. They are a little long in the tooth at receiver, and, with Tyler Lockett. And I just think that John Schneider, I'm not saying it's brilliant, but I just think he did an excellent job.
No, I would agree with you, Peter. I mean, I think that when you have a pick that high and you are the Seattle Seahawks, that's the attitude that you have to take. We may never be here again. We don't plan to be here ever again. So that's why we have to make the most of this kind of opportunity. And I like what they did. And I think you're right about the cornerstone positions, right? Corner, receiver. That's what you need. I mean, and Lockett is getting a little bit older. You still have DK Metcalf, and you expect him to continue to be the number 1 guy. But with Jackson Smith and Jigba can do, and we've seen it in, with CJ Stroud in the Rose Bowl game in particular. I mean, that guy is a really dynamic football player. So if you add that to that offense and you add that to Geno Smith, I mean, that the Seattle Seahawks really could be doing something here. They're building something.
Look, the way to look at it, Miles, the Seattle Seahawks far and away had the best draft of any team in the NFC West. And I think, I mean, there's a gap to be closed with the 49ers, but they made some damn good progress over the weekend, at least in my opinion. I want to say one thing about one other team in that division, and that is the Arizona Cardinals, because Monty Ossenfort entered this weekend with more holes to plug than any general manager in football. He makes 3 trades in the first 34 picks with Houston, Detroit, and Tennessee. And he ended up with the tackle he wanted, Paris Johnson, a linebacker, B.J. Ojulari, and a corner named Garrett Williams from Syracuse. But more importantly, in those 3 trades, he got a first-round pick in 2024 and 2 third-round picks in 2024. And what that gives the Arizona Cardinals is control of that draft. Not only six picks in the top 3 rounds in 2024. But to me, more importantly, 2 of those picks are in the first round, and they belong, as Pro Football Focus analyst Timo Risky reported. I just DM'd with him on Sunday during the day, and he explained to him, how about this, Myles? He ran 10,000 simulations of the 2023 football season. And in those simulations with the current rosters, he found that the Arizona Cardinals and Houston Texans were the 2 teams that were favored to pick 1 and 2 in the draft next year. So if that happens, this is an unbelievable trade, because look, I don't know whether Arizona is going to, I don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen with Kyler Murray, and who knows, they could end up trading the pick, if they trading 1 or both of the picks, and get absolutely filthy rich over the next 3 or 4 years. So I think Monty Ossenfort really had a good draft for the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah, and look, they needed a good draft. They needed to pick up some assets, and I think getting that Houston first rounder in 2024 is certainly good. Now, I mean, who knows? That AFC South division, I think we would all probably expect that the Jaguars are going to keep rising, but who knows? D'Amico Ryans could make a really significant difference as a head coach. CJ Stroud could make a really significant difference as a quarterback. So that pick may end up being in the teens, if not lower. But if it does so happen to be in the top 5 or in the top 2, boy, that would be some kind of haul for the Arizona Cardinals.
I had a very interesting conversation late Saturday with Lucas Van Ness, defensive end from Iowa, who was drafted 13th overall, by the Green Bay Packers. And what's amazing about it is that he never started a game in 2 years at Iowa, because they have a seniority system in Iowa. And the 2 defensive ends who were most senior there, John Wagner and Joe Evans, they started at defensive end. Van Ness played more snaps than either one of them last year. The scouts loved him. He's got a very relentless style. But anyway, I ended up talking to him, and he was shocked when I told him that he's the first guy ever in 88 drafts. And look, there are no official records, but Joel Bussard, who's sort of the league historian, said that apparently he's the first college football player to be drafted in the first round and to never start a game in college. So it's pretty amazing. And the amazing thing is, Lucas Van Ness was totally complimentary of the program at Iowa and of the approach that the Iowa coaches took with him, that I thought was just so noble. Like, with now that you're out of there, wouldn't you say, well, it is what it is, and hey, I'm a team guy, but it is kind of ridiculous I never started. But anyway, Kirk Ferentz, he wouldn't, Kyle Van Ness or Lucas Van Ness just simply wouldn't say that, because I don't think he believes it. He goes, I would not have developed into the player that I did had I not gone to Iowa, because they took their time. They told me every step of the way what they were doing with me, blah, blah, blah. It's a very, very interesting kid, and I think the story is going to be cool. One little tidbit. Lucas Van Ness, defensive end, Green Bay Packers, is dating the sister of Cole Kmet, tight end, Chicago Bears. So just imagine he's going to line up. The Bears and Packers play twice a year. At some point, Lucas Van Ness is going to line up across the line from maybe his future brother-in-law. So he said, he played it straight, but you could tell that he's kind of looking forward to the day where that happens. It'll be kind of fun. But Myles, one other thing I really kind of wanted to talk about, and nobody really is going to say anything, wow, Jacksonville had a great draft. Trent Baalke had a great draft. But let me tell you what Trent Baalke did that I really, really like. So Jacksonville had the 24th pick. Everybody on God's green earth knew that they were going to take a tackle or wanted to take a tackle.
Yes.
They have a big hole at tackle. And so they were going to take a tackle. So there they were at 24. And so the New York Giants called. They're at 25. And the Jacksonville says, okay, we'll trade. So they pick up 5th and 7th round picks to move down one spot. Then the Bills call, and the Bills want to give them a 4th round pick to move from 27 to 25. So Baalke says, okay. So at number 27, he picks the guy that almost certainly he would have picked at 24, Oklahoma tackle Anton Harrison. And for picking the same guy and paying him less money, because the 27th pick is slotted to make less money than the 24th pick, he got 3 extra draft picks, 130, 160, and 240 overall in this draft. And I just thought, I don't think anybody maximized resources any better, even though it wasn't a huge deal. But, hats off to Trent Baalke for being smart and understanding how to work this draft. The last point about working the draft, I like the fact that Les Snead took Stetson Bennett, the Georgia quarterback, the undersized guy, because they need a backup for Matthew Stafford, who's missed 16 games in the last 4 years. And Les Snead's attitude was very simple. Look, I'm not saying this guy is going to be a long-term NFL starter, but we need somebody who's not going to be afraid to come in and to play right away if need be. This guy's played at the highest level of college football 2 years in a row and been a stud. So let's take him. So anyway, few last thoughts from me.
Well, and it's not often that you can draft a quarterback with an AARP card. So I guess that also kind of helps.
That is not a bad line, Myles Simmons.
I don't know.
That is why you are podcast gold.
Peter, though, I'll say one thing about Stetson Bennett. It takes a lot for me to really not like a draft pick. I did not like that pick for the Rams, and it's partially because they just went through a period with a backup who was very undersized in John Wolford, and they proved that he just is not a very good player, right? And and he wasn't a viable backup, which is why you need a backup in the first place. I wouldn't have gone down that route, but we'll see if it works for him. Stetson Bennett probably has a much, much, much better arm than a John Wolford, but the undersized quarterback thing, when you're backing up a Matthew Stafford, I should say, I don't know how much I like that.
Myles Simmons, thanks for staying up with me on a Sunday night to get
3 hours earlier out here, man. Done. It's fine.
It is early out there. Jeez, it's only 8:00 out there.
Yeah, it's great.
You're a lucky man. Well, I'll hopefully be in bed in about an hour. I got to finish up my column. But anyway, we appreciate everybody hanging in with us. And we hope you enjoy this week's episode of the podcast. We'll be back next week. I think we're going to have 2 more podcasts before going on hiatus. I have absolutely no idea what we'll talk about next week. But then again, those are usually the best podcasts when you wing it right out of the old wazoo. Anyway, Myles Simmons, thanks so much. Thanks, everyone, for listening and experiencing this episode of the Peter King Podcast. Please rate, enjoy, experience our podcast, and come back early and often for all future episodes. And also, read my draft column at NBCSports.com and ProFootballTalk.com. We will be back next week with another episode of the Peter King Podcast.
Hi, I'm Mike Tirico, and thanks for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe for the latest news and highlights from NBC Sports.